Last class, we talked about the 1920s in Europe and Asia, and today we're going to be focusing on the 1920s in the United States. So, the first thing to know about the 1920s in the United States is it was directly influenced by World War I and everything that had happened in the previous decade, including the Russian Revolution. So, one of the first major events of the 1920s was the Red Scare, and this was after the Russian Revolution, after it had created the world's first communist nation. All of a sudden, communism is no longer just an idea or a theory or an ideology or a belief system. It was now actually real. It was a country, and a lot of Americans were terrified that the U.S. might fall to communism as well. I mean, if the great Russian Empire could fall to the Red Menace, as it was called, who's to say that America might not fall to communism as well if we ever let our guard down? All right, so this justified fear, really. It quickly turned into hysteria and paranoia, and a lot of people were arrested or even deported based just on suspicion alone, even when there was no real evidence to proclaim that they were a communist. Now, the U.S. economy during the 1920s was excellent. It was absolutely fantastic. The U.S. emerged from World War I as one of the victors, and also the United States was a place where the war didn't actually take place. Since the war occurred in Europe, that meant the U.S. didn't have any post-war damage that they needed to rebuild. So our infrastructure was still intact, our economy was booming, coming off of the war, going into peacetime. And a lot of new industries boomed in the 1920s as well, most of all the car industry. So you have Henry Ford creating the assembly line and the Model T, which he called it. And cars began to be mass produced in factories on the assembly line to where most families could afford to have a car. So new technologies like cars, like radios, even silent movies, created a lot of jobs in the US. And this led to consumerism, sometimes materialism, which means being obsessed with stuff instead of with, being concerned with people. But ultimately, it did lead to prosperity. There was a lot of prosperity. It was overall a happy time in America. Now, the automobile industry transformed the United States. Cars meant faster transportation. It expanded tourism, which as well was good for the economy. And it made people feel connected to each other in a way that they never had before in America. People in rural areas were now much more connected to people in urban areas. It used to be if you lived on a farm, you hardly had any contact with other people. Now that you have a car, that means you're only a 30 minutes drive away from a town or a city. So people now had more choice in where they lived. You didn't have to live right by the place where you worked. You could live several miles away and still be able to get there every morning, get back every evening because you had a car. The presidents during the Roaring Twenties, as they're called in America, were Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. So Harding won the election of 1920. And if you remember, the last of the progressive amendments was the 19th Amendment, which allowed women to vote. So Harding won the first election in which women could vote all across the country. Remember, like I said, about half of states had already allowed women to vote before the 19th Amendment, but the 1920 election was the first one after the 19th Amendment where every state now had women voting. Harding was also the first president to ever speak on the radio. That was a brand new technology, and people were obsessed with it. You could actually hear people now, and it was being broadcast all across the country, and it was a form of entertainment when you could listen to music or talk radio or speeches by the president. And his campaign promise was a return to normalcy. Remember, we're fresh off the heels of World War I. America does not want to be involved in any European conflicts anymore. We want to be isolated again, and Harding promises a return to normalcy. He basically said, we'll make America normal again. No more crazy wars. Things are going to be just fine. And after Warren G. Harding came Calvin Coolidge. So Coolidge was called Silent Cal. And the reason he was called Silent Cal is because he rarely ever spoke or even took much action. And he believed people were most free and most prosperous when government doesn't interfere in their lives at all. So he believed in small government. He believed in repealing laws more than making laws. And he said the government that governs best governs least. So he did as little as possible intentionally. It wasn't because he was lazy. He believed that was the best way to govern. And he was not a bad president. Sometimes having a very active president is what the country needs, like with Theodore Roosevelt, and sometimes having a very passive president is what the country needs, like with Calvin Coolidge. All right, so good presidents for different times in our history. Remember, the 18th Amendment made alcohol illegal in the U.S. That was the Prohibition Amendment. So this law, which people just referred to as Prohibition, this was made in an attempt to lower the crime rate. All right, so at the time, about half of all violent crime was committed by people who were under the influence of alcohol. So the logic went, hey, if we outlaw liquor, if we make alcohol illegal, then that means that our crime rate will be cut in half, right? Makes sense. Except it was a miserable failure. It did not work at all. And that leads to the question, can you legislate morality? Can you can you require it by law for people to be morally good? And that's still a question we wrestle with today. So the results of Prohibition was that the crime rate actually increased dramatically, which is the opposite of what people thought would happen. And this was because people illegally produced their own alcohol and transported it. Couldn't stop people from drinking, so they just did it illegally, and the transport business became organized crime. All right, this led to the growth of the mafia and organized crime. People like Al Capone, gangsters, became rich by bootlegging, they called it. Bootlegging alcohol, sneaking it across the Canadian border, for example, producing it illegally and then running it from town to town and selling illegally with that. I mean, that's tax evasion in addition to breaking the prohibition law. And a lot of times these gangsters like Al Capone, they would kill all of those who opposed them. And the police could not really enforce the law very well because crime was so rampant. Everyone was committing these crimes. Sometimes it was a family business. That's why the FBI was created at this time. So prohibition was seen as like a noble experiment that failed. The people who passed prohibition, they meant well. Their intention was to lower crime, but really it just did the exact opposite. So prohibition ended with the 21st Amendment in 1933 after it had been the law of the land for 14 years. The Harlem Renaissance also occurred in the 1920s, and this was kind of a rebirth of African American culture. Remember, the word Renaissance means rebirth, and this was a rebirth of African American culture, especially in mostly black neighborhoods like Harlem in New York City. So you have writers like Langston Hughes, musicians like Louis Armstrong. They really started to display their genius in their crafts, and black culture became much more mainstream. It became much more accepted in white society. Now, for the first time, you have white people listening to black music, reading reading books and poems that were written by black authors and poets. All right, so this was a big step forward for the African American community. Also in the 1920s, you have something called a clash of values. That's what historians call it, a clash of values. And this was basically a reaction against World War I. You had the younger generation, especially young girls, for the most part, they very much wanted to be different from their parents. They said, okay, our parents with these traditional, old-fashioned values, what did that get us? It got us World War I, and that was the bloodiest, most catastrophic war of all time, so we don't want anything to do with that. We want different values. We want to decide what's right and wrong for ourselves, because obviously what's going on in society now is not working. Okay? So they tried to reconstruct society under a new set of values. One group of women that became kind of synonymous with this clash of values were called flappers. And these were young women who kind of abandoned traditional gender roles. They typically had very short hair, basically things that were considered feminine, they rejected, right? So long hair is considered feminine, they cut their hair really short. Modesty is considered feminine, like wearing long skirts and not showing too much skin, so they decided to show a lot of skin and wear short skirts. They also danced, smoked, and drank in public, all of which was very much frowned upon by the majority of society. So this caused a lot of division within the U.S. as the values of the younger generation, which was more liberal, clashed with the values of the older generation, which was much more conservative. And finally, here with 1920s America, the authors of the Lost Generation. You have people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway. They wrote books that were very highly critical of this new 1920s American culture. So they also had lived through World War I and were a part of this younger generation, you could say, but they were also very critical of it. So these American writers, they did not like all this materialism and consumerism, that people became obsessed with stuff instead of with what really matters, like personal relationships. And they said that America had become a morally depraved society in the years after World War I. And they saw this taking shape in the U.S., and as a result, people like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, they moved away to Paris. They were called the expatriates, and they lived in Paris, and that's where they wrote their novels. One of the most famous novels of the 1920s was The Great Gatsby. If you want to really understand what life was like in America in the 1920s, The Great Gatsby is the perfect place to look. Ernest Hemingway wrote a bunch of very well-known and well-respected novels, including The Sun Also Rises, which is about the 1920s, A Farewell to Arms, which is about World War I. What's another one? The Old Man and the Sea, and then also For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is about the Spanish Civil War. All right, so these were very influential authors during the 1920s, and they were called members of the Lost Generation. All right, so you have this clash of values taking place in the United States, and it's mostly over controversial issues. So controversy is something that has not gone away in our society, or really in any society, and there are a lot of topics that are controversial. So looking back to your bell work for today, I asked you to name 10 topics that are controversial in society today. So I want you to look back on that list that you made of those 10 topics that are controversial and think, what makes something controversial? And also, why is it good to try to understand both sides of a controversial topic? I want you guys to kind of think about those two questions as we talk about this last concept here, this last event that took place during the 1920s. Okay, so before we get into that, I want to show you this quote here. It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Aristotle said that. He was a very wise person. And I really like this quote because it says you should try to understand why people think and believe what they believe without necessarily just blindly accepting things. Okay, so just saying I'm offended shuts down the thinking process. And then on the other hand, just accepting every theory or opinion also shuts down the thinking process. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the Scopes monkey trial. Okay, the Scopes trial, it took place in 1925 in Tennessee, and this was really the highlight of what became known as the clash of values. It really showed what the 1920s was all about, the shift that was happening in Western society, and really the divisions and differences of opinion that so many Americans had. Okay, so this clash of values, like we said, movies and radio content were things that people disagreed on. Smoking, some people thought it was okay in public, okay for women to do it. Some thought, no, it's bad. Dancing, partying, sex, prohibition, drinking, birth control, that was kind of a new thing, becoming more advanced. Science and religion, okay, which is what the Scopes trial has to do with. So you see all these different topics. I chose one of them to highlight here just so you can kind of understand the 1920s culture a little bit better, while at the same time understanding this really important event called the Scopes trial. Okay, so just a little disclaimer before we jump into it. I'm not going to give you my opinion about this. It does have to do with controversial issues. Hopefully we are all mature enough to handle it. I'm not going to be giving you my opinion. I'm just going to teach you the facts about what each side believed about this issue. That way you can understand this historical event a little bit better. Okay, so first off, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Back in the 1800s, during Queen Victoria's time as Queen of England, Charles Darwin was a scientist who came up with this theory that got a lot of people thinking. And it was the theory that humans came into existence by evolving from other species. all species dating back to a common ancestor, millions or perhaps even billions of years ago. Okay, so this was an entirely new theory in the 1800s when Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species. And there are several reasons why this theory was and really still is controversial. And the biggest part of that is because the Bible and other religious texts states that humans were created by God, not evolved from apes. So how could Charles Darwin say something that seems to contradict the Bible in such a way? A second component of this theory that is controversial is that it asserts the age of the Earth to be millions or billions of years old as factual, whereas the age of the Earth is speculation, not fact. You can't tell for sure exactly how old the Earth is, so that was a little bit controversial as well. Okay, so where all this came into play in the 1920s happened in Dayton, Tennessee. All right, so in the 1920s, Tennessee had a law called the Butler Act, which made it illegal to teach human evolution in any public school. All right, so Tennessee had concluded that the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin was incorrect and it was immoral and went against the teachings of the Bible, and therefore they said that teachers should not be allowed to teach it in public schools. Then in 1925, a teacher named John Scopes, he was accused of violating this law in Dayton, Tennessee. So this attracted a ton of media attention in the summer of 1925 because people really cared about this issue, had very strong feelings on one side of the issue or the other. And in addition to this being a big issue, the two most famous lawyers in America decided to argue this case in court. All right, so this case in court. All right, so this was seen as kind of like the trial of the century in 1925. All eyes and ears were on Dayton, Tennessee. Everybody knew who these two lawyers were, and they really cared about the outcome of the trial. All right, so these two lawyers, the two most famous lawyers in the country, you have a guy named William Jennings Bryan, the guy on the right there. He was a fundamentalist Christian, believed that evolution was incorrect. And then you have Clarence Darrow on the left. He was a devout atheist and believed in the theory of evolution. All right, so you have Clarence Darrow arguing on the side of John Scopes to defend him. And then you have William Jennings Bryan arguing against him, saying that he should be had to have some consequence for breaking this law. So Clarence Darrow said that Scopes should be declared innocent because, as Darrow said, he said it shouldn't be illegal to teach what he called scientific fact over what he called fairy tales from the Bible. All right, now all of this was being broadcast by the radio, so people were listening into this. You can imagine how offended some people would get whenever this guy, Clarence Darrow from Chicago, representing the American Civil Liberties Union, comes down here and says such things. All right, but that was his argument that Scopes should be declared innocent because he said that evolution should be taught over what he called fairy tales from the Bible. And then William Jennings Bryan, he argued the exact opposite. He said that Scopes should be declared guilty because he taught children what Bryan called the lie of evolution instead of what he called the factual accounts of the Bible. So as you see here, these two positions could not have been more different. Okay, and both of these guys had very large personalities, alpha males, so to speak, and so it was a very entertaining trial, if nothing else. And whenever people were listening to this on the radio, they kept asking the question, which side is right? Because both of these guys were really smart. Both were making very compelling arguments. And people were asking, gosh, I mean, which side is right? They both sound so convincing. And I remember this question was asked to me one time in a class in college. I think what the professor asked was, does scientific evidence support the Bible? And of course, half the class said yes, half the class said no. And then I raised my hand and I said, well, it all depends on your interpretation of the evidence. I mean, everyone has the same evidence. We all have the same set of facts. We live on the same earth with the same science, really. And it all depends on your interpretation of the scientific evidence. And my professor said, give us an example. And so the example I gave was homologous structures. Okay, you guys might have learned about homologous structures, maybe in biology class. And this is a classic example of how you can get two different interpretations and come to two different conclusions from the same facts, from the same evidence. All right. So the facts are that a human arm, a cat's leg, a whale's fin, and a bat's wing, they all have very similar bone structures, as you can see in the diagram there. That's the facts right there, that our bone structures are very similar. However, you can come to a couple different conclusions, all depending on how you interpret that fact. So someone who believes in evolution will look at that and say that's evidence for evolution because we all must have come from a common ancestor in order to still have similar bone structures today. But then someone who does not believe in evolution and believes maybe in creation could say that's not evidence for evolution. That's not evidence that we have a common ancestor. It's evidence that all people and animals have a common creator. After all, whenever one person designs a house or a bunch of houses, they're all going to have some similarities because it comes from the same creative mind. All right, so you can see how you can logically come to both conclusions from the same set of evidence. It doesn't mean that either side is stupid or should be mocked. It just means that equally intelligent people can come to different conclusions based on their interpretation of the evidence. All right. So this debate went on for several days in July of 1925, and the verdict was that Bryan, the creationist, he technically won because Scopes did break the law, but his supporters took it as a loss because Scopes was only fined about $100, and Darrow had really made Bryan look very foolish by attacking his faith on the witness stand. Darrow had called Bryan as a witness and had really kind of mocked his faith and got him all in a tizzy, got him really flustered to the point where Bryan was standing up and just kind of shouting at them and kind of made a fool of himself in that way. So while Bryan did technically win, he looked very foolish on the witness stand by Clarence Darrow. Okay? In fact, he was so humiliated and it was so hard on him physically, so it just took a toll on his body that he actually died about 5 days after the trial. He died of a heart attack, probably because of all the stress that he went under while trying to defend his beliefs on the witness stand at the Scopes trial. Now, there's a fantastic movie that you can watch about the Scopes trial called Inherit the Wind. In fact, if we have time, I'll show you a clip from that movie in class, but you can find clips of it on YouTube. You can probably find the movie on Amazon. Really entertaining movie. It's called Inherit the Wind, about Bryan and Darrow during the Scopes trial. Really good acting, really good dialogue. You can kind of see the heated exchange that they had that really captured the national attention. So this trial was very culturally significant. Not only was this the first ever court trial that was broadcasted nationally on the radio, which would have been significant enough, but it was also about a topic that most Americans cared about very deeply. Okay, most Americans had very deeply held beliefs on one side of the issue or the other. So people cared about the outcome and tuned in to listen. So the Scopes monkey trial, as it was called, it really came to symbolize the clash of values that we talked about of the 1920s between traditional values and modern values, between more conservative values and more liberal values coming into our culture. And the Scopes trial is still very relevant today because this was really a turning point culturally regarding what is and is not taught in schools. As you probably know, it's kind of the opposite nowadays. Nowadays, in public schools, you cannot teach creation, and you have to teach evolution. Whereas in 1925, you couldn't teach evolution, and you had to teach creation. So it's kind of flipped in that way, and this was a big turning point. So whether you think that was a good or a bad thing, it's a really significant thing that society changed in such a way. And another reason why the Scopes trial is so relevant and significant is because fundamentalism or creationism versus evolution, it's still a very controversial topic in American society today. You still have books written about it, you still have debates about it, and it's still something that's very much in the national consciousness and interests people still today. All right, so I'm going to have a assignment for you now that this part is over. So just come and see me to get that assignment, and you can work on that for the rest of class. All right, let me know if you have any questions about this subject.